And we are back, and I am privileged to be joined in the studio this morning by Dr. Lebohang Liepollo Pheko, who is a political and feminist economist, a decolonial feminist and activist scholar with over 25 years of global impact. She is an international movement builder committed to infusing intersectionality and in her work and grounding rigorous research in movement struggles against imperialism and globalization. All words that I love to hear when I introduce somebody, a political and feminist economist, a decolonial feminist, and of course, an activist scholar working against imperialism and globalization. What a privilege and what an honor it is to have you with us this morning, Dr. Lebohang. How are you?
Thank you so much, Abdullah. Assalamu alaikum. I'm well.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And so, we'll go straight into it, Doctor. Yesterday, of course, at around 2 p.m., South Africa's Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, delivered the annual budget speech. He seemed to have presented, if not really a rosy picture, reason for what looks like steady optimism regarding the direction, at least economically, that South Africa is moving towards. Can we just start by summarizing very briefly the most important points from the speech and highlighting what you think were some of the really interesting things that we should kind of zero in on?
Sure. So, I mean, the one is that there was a narrow but very high yielding tax base, Abdullah. So it's heavily reliant on a small group of high earners and corporates. But what this obfuscates is obviously that everybody in this country is a taxpayer in different ways, and it only focuses on income tax, whereas there are multiple ways of paying taxes: VAT, food, petrol, fuel levies, and etc. And I'd like us to pick up on that later. The other thing is that the revenue gains that have been driven by SARS enforcement. So we have a very vigilant SARS tax regime system in South Africa, and it is also to do with the commodity windfalls that we've been experiencing over the past year, rather than structural reforms. So these gains were a combination of good luck, quite frankly, and of course a very vigilant taxing regime, which, as we have seen, this falls and a lot of our expenditure has been highly controversial. We can zero in on that. And lastly, to say that this fiscal consolidation, so this is really achieved through what we call spending compression, below inflation, health, education budgets, and wage containment, especially controversial in the context of public sector wages and the need for us to really be building and amplifying our capacity to produce and to produce teachers, nurses, to produce a health and education system that is pro-people and that is driven from the ground up. And lastly, the infrastructure promises that were repeated but undermined by very weak municipal and SOE capacity. So it was an interesting one, to say the very least. And of course, there's more that we can say around some of the civil society social movement perspectives, many of which I'm in deep sympathy for as well.
Thank you, Doctor. I mean, that's a very comprehensive look upon the things that were presented to the nation yesterday. And I mean, yes, I agree that I myself I'm relatively new to South Africa, and something that really surprised me was really how SARS works in this country,
Right.
and the sort of technology that they have access to as compared to a lot of sort of taxing agencies in other places. But I'm glad that you kind of, mentioned that we should look upon a lot of these, what I guess people would, well, I guess have been described in the media as gains, actually, with something of a critical eye. So as you say, of course, there were a few things that were highlighted as, like victories for the taxpayer. The change in personal income tax bands, the threshold for value-added tax for small businesses increasing from 1 million to 2.3 million, and of course the scrapping of the objective of raising another 20 billion rand through tax. And I mean, if we kind of go a little bit more deeply into it, I mean, what are some of the reasons that prompted the minister and the finance ministry to make these decisions?
Well, I think there's a few things. Last year, you're probably aware of why it's shaped this way. Firstly, the political constraints. The last year's the VAT revolt set a precedent politically, that large tax hikes seem rather radioactive, to say the very least. The other piece of that is that coalition politics and stakeholder pressures. So that would be social movements, so-called civil society, business, the interests of big business versus the middle class, which is actually a small, but I think when we say middle class, we should actually talk about the elite class, the highest income earners, the millionaire class. Also mean that Treasury is avoiding bold reforms at this moment. And the result of this was also an enforcementism instead of systemic and incremental redesign and redistribution. Another thing, of course, is, as you rightly say, Abdullah, is the reliance on SARS enforcement. So revenue credibility rests on SARS compliance drives, audits, digital systems, this technology that you are alluding to. And now with the commissioner, who is departing, and the leadership continuity under Kiswita as well. Enforcement substitutes are still a high risk, especially in this politically difficult tax environment. And I think the third part of that is the fiscal consolidation strategy. So debt stabilization was achieved by spending through compression, as I said at the outset. So that's below inflation wages, below inflation healthcare, and below inflation education budget delays. So this really means that there's stabilization, but without any real growth and any real transformation. The downside of all of this is obviously that this means that we need to be very wary of the quality of care, the quality of public sector expenditure, the quality and the reach of this expenditure. One of the problems that South Africa has is not per se our tax revenue base. It is the way that money is then distributed. It is which of course is the cause of great controversy. Now, even though IMF and other really neoliberal institutions have warned that consolidation has to be growth friendly, and people like myself, and I'm sure yourself, have for many years been critiquing this idea of externally driven growth, of the growth of foreign direct investment, and of growth,
Hmm.
economic growth that doesn't lead to communities impact in any way in terms of
Hmm.
hunger, in
Absolutely.
terms of homelessness, and all of this. So what we're risking is entrenching potentially high economic yields, yes, windfall taxes, but very low human growth.
Absolutely, and thank you for bringing that up because, as I was, of course, doing my preparation last night, of course, I noticed that a lot of the coverage is largely positive, but when we look more deeply into it, especially as political economists, like there are reasons for alarm, and especially like in relation to the fact that um, different, every South African is a taxpayer in their own way, but everybody's kind of has this very narrow idea of what counts as tax,
Yes.
as you've said already. Um, Doctor, we have to go to an ad break, but I would really love to keep you on afterwards to continue this really important conversation. Will you hang on with us for a few minutes?
I will certainly hang on for a few minutes.
Thank you so much. And with that, we will go to a short break and we'll be back with Dr. Lebohang after that to continue discussing the budget. Please stay tuned.
For the first time, I can dream again. The African
listening to Salam Media live from our headquarters in South Africa. This is Salam Media, keeping you company this Ramadan.
And we are back. For those that missed the first part of the show, we're back with Dr. Lebohang Liepollo Pheko, and we are discussing the budget, the South Africa budget that was released yesterday in Minister Godongwana's speech at around 2 p.m. And we left off kind of on this note of discussing how although a lot of the mainstream media here in South Africa have presented this as a very positive budget, there are reasons for alarm and reasons for us to be concerned, especially if we are thinking about how we can kind of shape the economy in a way that is transformative and benefits the majority of the population here in South Africa. And so, I mean, at this point, it's almost churlish of me to ask, because we've kind of discussed this already in quite some depth. But to what extent do you think South Africans and people who live here can breathe a sigh of relief in terms of things like inflation and the cost of living and the persistent economic challenges that people have been facing for the last few years?
Sure.
And to what extent is this kind of targeted towards a particular socioeconomic class?
Sure. I think we can never ask the questions enough, really. So even though the revenue looks quite strong, Abdullah, it's really built on commodity windfalls, which are very discretionary and very random. It's built on inflation. It's built on SARS enforcement. It's not really built on any structural attempts to transfer wealth from the most, overprivileged people in this country to the most indigent, which is the African majority. So ordinary households really carry the weight through value-added tax, through fuel levies, through excise taxes, which hit the most indigent the hardest. And I'm very wary of this idea that there's a small class of people who pay taxes, because it also is a historical model of understanding how tax works, right? It also is an ahistorical, deracialized understanding of how and who certain sectors of society manage to become overprivileged, with very little effort, and have become and retained their social strata as the highest income earners historically. And that's a white minority. And I think it also is very important to note that a lot of this language has been the rhetoric of only a few people are paying tax, has been weaponized to use a rhetoric that's really anti-African and anti-Black, suggesting that most African people are somehow delinquent in their tax obligations. I think another thing, of course, is that the coalition politics that we're seeing right now mean that bold reforms like wealth taxes, like corporate base expansions, have been completely avoided. So this budget, represents constraint and not ambition. Now, it's fortunate that Minister Gondwana last year decided not to make good on his promise to then tax us further, a further 20 billion, because of the very vigorous tax collection regime that we have in this country. However, what we really also have to be careful is that SARS is not a substitute for policy. So the efficacy of our tax regime cannot be a replacement or a substitute for the redistributional obligation that the state budget actually has. Now, when people say things like that the public sector wage bill is too high, and that does account for about 30% of the total fiscus, it means that they're suggesting that public sector teachers, teachers in public schools, public sector healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, people who work in the post office, people who work at SARS, people who sweep the streets, those are all public sector workers, for example. It's suggesting that either they should be underpaid, or suggesting that instead of having a classroom full of 30 children per teacher, we should then cut down on the number of teachers and have 100 students per teacher. And I think that's exactly the kind of class bias that is completely tone deaf to the social realities of the majority of people in this country.
Absolutely. And I mean, the other corollary, of course, to cutting down on the public sector budget is, of course, to then privatize and to outsource a lot of these responsibilities, which, as far as I understand, in South Africa has had a very mixed record, even tending towards probably a negative one.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean that leans, Abdullah, to this kind of deficit narrowing is then achieved by compressing health, education, and infrastructure budgets. And as you say, that's basically polite austerity, austerity by stealth. Now, this might stabilize the debt to GDP ratios, but it absolutely undermines service delivery, state obligations, growth capacity. And of course, it also undermines the ability of states to remain states. If we outsource and we turn our public services into goods that can be bought and sold, and instead of treating citizens like citizens, we then turn them into clients and consumers. That is a very slippery slope. And we've seen globally that structural adjustment, however politely we might want to characterize it, globalization, privatization, public-private partnerships, etc. None of these things ultimately do anything to uphold the integrity of state functions. And it also, of course, continues to bring in extreme division and extreme inequality between those who can afford and those who cannot afford. And we cannot afford the rhetoric of the poor will always be with us, because certainly poverty, as we know, is also an invented, constructed invention of capitalism and hyper-globalization.
Absolutely. And I mean, even if we want to look at it in plain economic terms, the process of privatizing and outsourcing effectively is like a cup of really bad instant coffee. You'll have a bit of a, a bit of a sudden like buzz, and then after that, a complete crash. A lot of people over here, sorry. I very recently was in the UK for very many years, where I was studying, and a lot of people here seem to have a very rosy idea of what it's like over there, but effectively we're seeing over there the effects of privatizing all the state functions. Service delivery is ridiculously expensive. Trains, for example, public transport don't run on time. Again, sort of the citizens are treated as consumers, and are treated as effectively like a form of tax base, but for the private sector, and are hyper exploited in that regard. And so, I mean, it's even more of a slippery slope in a country that's kind of emerging from a situation of colonization, much less one that was itself the colonizer who extracted wealth from the rest of the world. And so I think it's really important to kind of mention that. And then turning kind of towards infrastructure. So if I'm quoting from an article that I read yesterday, the government is ramping up investment in logistics, energy, water, and sanitation projects, with the budget providing for 1.07 trillion rands in infrastructure investment over the next 3 fiscal years. And then it kind of says afterwards, with the government and state companies lacking implementation capacity, a slew of contracts should be up for grabs, which is a sentence that, kind of gave me reason for concern. Should we be concerned by that sentence?
It's extremely chilling. So, I mean, you're right. The Treasury has framed this. I mean, infrastructure is emphasized. It was emphasized both in the budget speech and also in the State of the Nation address a few weeks ago, as you and the viewers will be aware of. And allocations have been made to transport, to logistics, to energy reform, and to municipal projects, which is a controversial topic at the moment. So Treasury has presented infrastructure as this lever for growth and for credibility. And it's trying to signal to investors, because it's always about investors and looking outward instead of looking inward to the spine of our own economic development, as it should support social redistribution. And now, we kind of calling these bottlenecks, I think, really is a euphemism. Calling this execution delivery bottlenecks is really a euphemism, and letting themselves off the hook quite a bit. So the first part of these euphemisms are calling them municipal capacity limitations. These are not limitations. These are years and years of looting, of the result of cadre deployment, oftentimes misalignment of the skills that are necessary to run this. And of course, a culture that has meant that there's very little accountability for failure, for malfeasance, for egregious misexpenditure, or even misappropriation of funds. And then these procurement bottlenecks, which again are the result of the sort of systemic and structural failures to present to bring accountability, to follow basic legislation like the Public Finance Management Act (PFMA) or the Municipal Finance Management Act, where key procurement structures. I mean, years ago, it feels like 1,000 years ago, when I was a public servant myself for my sins, this stuff was coming out of us like air. You know, you had to eat, breathe it. Any decision you wanted to make, even to buy a paper clip, you had to follow these protocols. And I see that there's been seems to have been quite a relaxation since then. The other part of this are the SOE, state-owned enterprise inefficiencies, Abdullah. And I mean, much has been said about the state of SAA, the state of our transport, our and railway network, the decommissioning of large sheaves of our railways during the COVID pandemic, which for some reason are only now being recommissioned, and which has meant that, of course, millions of people across this country have lost access to a very important, efficient, largely efficient, and largely cost-effective form of transportation, again left to the vagaries of private transport services, which are the public taxis, the vans that many of us are aware of, and those are that is not public transport. And again, that is the state stepping back from its obligations as well. Another side effect of that is what that has done to the roads with the increase in trucks and so forth. So all of these SOE inefficiencies have real life consequences in real time on all of our lives. And I think lastly to say that allocations alone do not translate, Abdullah, into completed projects. They don't translate into anything that is meaningful and impactful for the people in this country. And so even though our infrastructure is often reprioritized, shifted around instead of being expanded, it does mean that our per capita investments remain stagnant, and oftentimes cannot be efficiently accounted for.
Absolutely. And I mean, unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time, but there are still so many things that we really need to dig into. For example, like the issue of punishing municipalities that don't settle their debts. The excise taxes as well is something super important to talk about. Of course, that's one of the main ways in which people do pay tax in this country. And of course, as you mentioned at the very top of the hour, the fuel levy. And so just before we wrap up, can I give you maybe like a minute to kind of talk about one of these things that you regard as being really important to mention before we end?
I think, Abdullah, one of the things that's really important is to think around the way that, for example, participatory budgeting would help us to rethink community-driven infrastructure priorities. That's really important. I think the Budget Justice Coalition have spoken about this. I think it's also important to reimagine what taxes actually are. And for quite some time, a few scholar activists, including myself, have been arguing that we need to reimagine that taxes are, progressive taxes, which are linked to a different kind of tax bracketing as well. We also have to reimagine that our taxes and excises, for example, should not penalize the people who are the most indigent, the working poor, the working class. Rather, that we need to really reimagine and to push for much more fiscal boldness, where we're able to tax and to demand taxes from your 1%ers or your 0.1%ers as well. And I think lastly to say that even when we're thinking around our healthcare infrastructure and these sin taxes, when you speak about excises, these sin taxes on the sugar, the alcohol, the cigarette, the nicotine taxes that are often paid, Abdullah, these need to be ideally funding healthcare, not going into the ether as well. So, I mean, I think that in terms of really targeted taxes, where we have to see much more accountable tax, and where our taxes land in ways that are visible to us, tangible to us, and are meaningful and impactful for us. Because, by the way, this is actually our money.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Lebohang Liepollo Pheko. It's been a pleasure. And I'm just going to end by reading out your bio again, because it's some of my favorite words, as I said. Dr. Pheko is a political and feminist economist, a decolonial feminist and activist scholar with over 25 years of global impact. She is an international movement builder, committed to infusing intersectionality in her work and grounding rigorous research in movement struggles against imperialism and globalization. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you. You too as well. Thank you. And we'll be back after this break.